This video is made possible by the free-to-play action game Crossout. Check out the game through the link in the description below, and you can start with 3 extra weapons or a vehicle cabin, and that's just for registering. So, war can be cruel, it can be brutal, and every once in a while, it can throw up events that are just plain weird. The Second World War was the largest war that's ever been fought, and it was certainly no exception. In the video today, we're taking a closer look at some of the stranger events from history's most destructive war. Number 10. The toilet malfunction that cost Germany a U-boat. In April 1945, the crew of the German submarine U-1206 completed their training, and under their newly promoted commander Karl Adolf Schlitt, they set out on their first patrol. The war was already as good as lost at this point, but Germany had still boasted the most technologically advanced fleet of submarines in the world. This even included the sophistication of their toilet facilities. While British submarines stored waste in human tanks to be disposed of when they returned to the docks, U-1206 was equipped with high-tech toilets that used compressed air to blast waste into the sea, even when they were deep underwater. It was, however, a complex system, and on April 14, 1945, it malfunctioned, causing seawater and sewage to flood into the submarine. The situation rapidly deteriorated from disgusting to potentially deadly when the mixture leaked into the submarine's batteries, causing them to discharge chlorine gas. Karl Adolf Schlitt had no choice but to give the order to surface just off the coast of Scotland, where the U-boat was almost immediately spotted and attacked by the British Royal Air Force. 3 crew members were killed and the submarine was destroyed, all because of a malfunctioning toilet. Number 9. Kyoungjong. Many people join the army out of a strong sense of loyalty to their country. Others are conscripted whether they like it or not. Then there's the unfortunate few who find themselves forced to fight for a foreign power to whom they owe no allegiance whatsoever. For a Korean man named Kyoungjong, this became a recurring feature of his life. For the first part of the 20th century, Korea was occupied by Japan. Koreans were treated as second-class citizens, and thousands of them were forced to serve as cannon fodder in Imperial Japan's growing collection of wars. When Kyoungjong was pressed into service and sent to fight in the Soviet-Japanese War of 1939, his prospects were not exactly good. Kyoungjong, he survived, but he found himself captured and sent to one of the Soviet Union's brutal labor camps. He may well have toiled there until his death, but for Nazi Germany's invasion in 1941. With the Soviet Union suffering horrific losses and running short of manpower, Kyoungjong was forced to join the Red Army and sent to fight and die on the Eastern Front. History repeated itself as Kyoungjong was once again captured and recruited, this time eventually finding himself almost 6,000 miles from home in France, fighting for the German army. Unwilling to fight to the death for Hitler's dream of a racially pure Europe, he surrendered to the Allies at the earliest opportunity. Initially believed to be a Japanese soldier who had somehow found himself under German command, the truth of Kyoungjong's unique story didn't emerge until some time later. Number 8. The puzzle of the Daily Telegraph crossword. The Allied invasion of Western Europe had a huge amount riding on it. If the 1944 invasion went wrong, then tens of thousands of Allied troops would be killed or captured, and it wouldn't have been possible to launch a fresh attempt until 1945 at the earliest. In order to maintain the advantage of surprise, the operation was planned in the strictest secrecy. Only a handful of senior officers were aware of the details. It was therefore a cause of immense concern when, over the course of just a few weeks, a whole string of code words relating to the invasion appeared in the answers to the Daily Telegraph newspaper's crossword puzzle. These included Overlord, which was the name of the operation itself, Neptune, which referred to the naval component of the assault, Mulberry, which was the name given to the top-secret floating harbors developed by the Allies, and on top of all that, the code names for 2 of the 5 invasion beaches. Fearing that enemy spies had somehow infiltrated the highest levels of the military, Britain's Secret Service pounced. Leonard Dorr, the man who'd compiled the crossword puzzles, he was taken in for questioning. Dorr insisted that he had done nothing wrong. He hadn't been attempting to communicate with the Germans, and certainly he wasn't a spy. It seems that he was telling the truth. As far as is known, Dorr chose the words through sheer coincidence, perhaps having overheard them mentioned by military personnel in his hometown of Bury St Edmunds. Well, yeah, either that or he was a really good spy. Number 7. The Battle of Castle Itter. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler shot himself through the head. The war in Europe, it wasn't over quite yet, but the Third Reich, it was clearly doomed. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians were on the move, the vast majority heading west, attempting to escape the Soviet Red Army and surrender to the Western Allies. As order broke down, the German guards at Castle Itter in Austria, they fled their posts. The castle had been converted into a prison in which to hold some of Germany's highest-profile prisoners. In 1945, this included 2 former French prime ministers, the man who had been commander-in-chief of France's army at the outbreak of the war, and one of the world's leading tennis players. With the disappearance of their guards, the prisoners rightly feared the fanatical troops of the Waffen-SS who were prowling the countryside in some numbers, and they might move in to finish them off. One of the prisoners set off with a bicycle in order to search for help. He returned with a ragtag force of a single Sherman tank, 18 Americans, and 10 German soldiers who had agreed to assist in what would be one of the last European battles of the war. The attack came on May 5th. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the unlikely force of American and German soldiers, assisted by the prisoners themselves, held the SS off for several hours until help finally arrived. The German commander was killed in action, but the Battle of Castle Itter is believed to be the only time that American and Wehrmacht soldiers fought side by side in World War II. Number 6. The Nazi invasion of North America. The ability to predict the weather with greater accuracy than an enemy provides a huge and often underestimated military advantage. Throughout the course of World War II, the British and Americans consistently benefited from more accurate reports than their German opponents. This was at least in part because the jet stream means weather systems tend to move from west to east across the Atlantic, making it easier for the Allies to make predictions about the weather in Europe. In an attempt to nullify this advantage, the Germans invaded North America, albeit on a very small scale. On October 22, 1943, a small group of armed German sailors arrived by submarine at a remote part of the Canadian Labrador coast. As far as is known, it is the only German military incursion into North America over the course of the entire war. It didn't last long, with the sailors remaining only long enough to set up an automated weather station. In order to conceal its true purpose, they labeled it as belonging to the Canadian Meteor Service. No such organization actually existed, but the subterfuge was nonetheless so successful that the truth of weather station Kurt wasn't discovered until 1981, having sat there undisturbed for 38 years. Alright, so just before we get into the top 5 today, I want to take a minute to tell you about today's sponsor, Crossout. Now, while there were certainly some strange tanks and weapons that were built for World War II, none of them can compare to what you can make in Crossout. So Crossout is an online vehicle action game where all of the vehicles, they're made by you, the player. Basically, what you do is you construct your own crazy vehicle from the ground up with all sorts of different parts. You can see from this clip that I'm playing right now, really, the freedom you have to create is pretty amazing. You can add weapons, support systems, a main structure, and a whole lot of other things to your vehicles. You can add things like railguns and rocket boosters and all sorts of different things. Basically, you're making your own incredible, strange, weird vehicle, and then you're going and smashing up other people's incredible, strange, and weird vehicles. It's a super fast-paced game. There are loads of different game modes, and you've got pretty much limitless freedom to create, and what you do to your vehicle is entirely up to you. And it's not complicated right at the beginning. There's a super easy learning curve, but mastering the game is a little bit more complicated. So it really keeps your attention on the game, which is a good thing. Loads of different game modes as well, so you're sure to find one you love. You can join us on the battlefield for free using the link in the description below. You can play if you've got a PC, Xbox One, PS4, any of those, and you're good to go. So going through that link below not only helps support this show, but it also gets you started with 3 extra weapons or a vehicle cabin, all as a bonus for registering. And going through that link, our link particular below, really does help support this show, so it would be awesome if you did that. Thanks to Crossout for sponsoring. And let's get into the top 5, shall we? Number 5. A reindeer lived on a British submarine. In June of 1941, Nazi Germany attacked the Soviet Union in what was the biggest offensive in the history of warfare. As the Soviet Union reeled under the onslaught, Britain and the United States of America attempted to keep the Soviets in the fight. They sent weapons, equipment, and supplies, almost all of which had to be delivered through the U-boat-infested waters of the Arctic Circle. The British submarine HMS Trident was just one of the vessels that was tasked with keeping these vital supply routes open. The Soviets were grateful, so grateful in fact that they offered the Trident's captain a gift in the form of a reindeer. Now, an adult reindeer stands at over 6 feet at the shoulder and weighs in at more than 200 pounds. As a species, they're entirely unsuited for life on a cramped World War II submarine. No surprises. Nonetheless, the British didn't want to appear rude. They accepted the unconventional gift, named her Pollyanna, and squeezed her onto the submarine through a torpedo tube. Pollyanna remained on the submarine for 6 weeks, surviving on scraps from the galley and sleeping in the captain's quarters. When the Trident returned to port in Britain, Pollyanna was relieved of duty and donated to Regent's Park Zoo. Number 4. An American warship almost torpedoed the president. The first ever meeting between Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, and Joseph Stalin began in Iran on November 28, 1943. President Roosevelt, whose health was already failing, had to make a long and dangerous journey through the U-boat-infested waters of the Atlantic. In theory, these German U-boats represented the greatest danger, but in practice it was an extraordinary incident involving an American destroyer that could have led to the president's untimely demise. Roosevelt would be transported to Iran on the battleship USS Iowa, but before he got underway, he asked for a demonstration of the Iowa's capabilities. What should have been a routine torpedo drill suddenly became altogether more lively when an American destroyer, the USS William D. Porter, broke radio silence with the startling news that they had accidentally fired a live torpedo directly at the president's battleship. Roosevelt appeared unperturbed, merely asking that his wheelchair be moved to the side of the battleship so that he could watch the torpedo approach. Fortunately for everybody concerned, the Iowa managed to evade the torpedo, but the entire crew of the USS William D. Porter were arrested on suspicion of attempting to assassinate the president. Chief torpedo man Lawton Dawson was eventually found to be responsible for the mistake. He was sentenced to hard labor, but Roosevelt personally intervened to have the sentence overturned. Number 3. The Death Match. Football is the most popular sport in the world. Countless matches have been played over the years, but perhaps the strangest and deadliest ever played was in 1942 in occupied Ukraine. Ukraine's official football league had been abandoned in the wake of the Nazi invasion, but an amateur team, which contained several formerly professional players, was put together by the manager of a bread factory in Kiev. When the newly formed team comfortably swept aside opponents made up of Romanians and another team raised from a German artillery unit, they attracted the attention of the German authorities. The Germans put together the strongest team they could muster and arranged a date for the match. Given that it was the Aryan master race against mere Ukrainians, they assumed victory to be inevitable. The Ukrainian team, who apparently hadn't gotten the memo, romped to a crushing 5-1 victory. The Germans demanded a do-over and arranged a second match to be played a few days later on August 9, 1942. Despite being warned that any repetition of the first result would be looked upon very dimly, the Ukrainians won 5-3, with all of the German team's goals being scored with the opposing goalkeeper having been knocked unconscious. In a rather sadder note, several of the Ukrainian players who took part were murdered by the Nazis over the next few months, earning the game the title of the Death Match. Was a rather grim ending to a quite entertaining entry. Number 2. A British officer went to war armed with a longbow. World War II was a war of technology, as well as manpower. Soldiers wanted the best equipment available, knowing that it could be the difference between life and death. One British soldier served as an exception to this rule, though, preferring to go into battle armed with bagpipes, a medieval broadsword, and a longbow. That man was Lieutenant Colonel Jack Churchill, also known as Mad Jack and Fighting Jack to his friends. He argued that any British officer going into battle without a sword was improperly dressed. As a deadly archer who had represented Great Britain in the World Archery Championships, if anyone was going to face the Germans armed with a bow and arrow, it was going to be him. He is often credited with being the last man to kill an enemy using a longbow in combat. He also took part in a raid on occupied Norway and the invasion of Sicily, on both occasions playing his bagpipes before drawing his sword and charging into hand-to-hand combat. In May of 1945, he requested to be transferred to the Far East to join the fight against Japan. As one of the few individuals who thoroughly enjoyed the war, he lamented that if the Yanks hadn't gotten themselves involved, it could have stretched on for another 10 years. Number 1. The Flight of Rudolf Hess. Rudolf Hess was a world-famous politician and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Indeed, he was Adolf Hitler's designated successor. All of this and more made him one of the last people in the world that the British expected to be apprehended skulking around a field in Scotland. And yet, in the early evening of May 10th, 1941, well, there he was. Things got even stranger after he was escorted to a local police station. Hess explains that he had flown in to personally negotiate peace between Britain and Germany. The fact that Hitler had not given him permission to do any such thing seems to not have deterred him in the slightest. He made a solo flight from Germany to Scotland in the hope of enlisting the help of Duke Hamilton XIV, who Hess believed he had once been acquainted with at a party. This was news to the Duke, who insisted that he'd never so much as met the Deputy Führer. Rather than being ushered to meet Winston Churchill, as he had expected, Hess was arrested and charged with crimes against peace. Psychologists determined that he wasn't insane, but that he was in a delicate mental state. He would remain imprisoned until his death in 1987. So I really hope you found that video interesting. If you did, hit that like button below, subscribe to this channel, why not? Hit the notification bell, that's a lot of things to click, but if you want one more, and it's the one I would most like you to click, that would be the link to Crossout, the game below, which helps support this show, and also you get those free perks and all that good stuff, and also it's a great game. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.